Okay, if I've done my counting right, this will be number 4 in the sequence on that drag time story. Was it story time? Something like that. Drag story time? Drag queen story time, that's what it was. And the actual real root causes that are behind all that society refuses to look at. And one of them is who has the monopoly on force and uses that as a way to punish people into compliance. So these are the people that are the executors of that force. These are the order followers. So we all saw, or most people, if they are wanting to be aware, can find evidence that after the Second World War, it was agreed upon universally that order following is the root of all evil, because what you're doing when you're following an order is you're abdicating is the word I'm trying to say, abdicating your own personal responsibility for the choices you make, and then you're delegating someone else that responsibility. You just need to do the execution of it, and you're still now vindicated, right? That idea, that doesn't fly. Yet society on every level does order following, and this is the result of it, right? Is who gets the monopoly on the use of force, and here they are. These are men and women that put on a costume. Now, I want you to imagine that they don't have that costume on, that they're just in everyday wear. What would this picture look like to you then? Because that's the way it needs to be viewed, to really see what's happening here. Because you can't really justify violence in the classic sense that you get to use force against someone else, but you can use protective force to protect yourself. That's justifiable if your life is under threat. Now, these people with these weapons, their lives are not under threat. There is no one being harmed here, right? It's just them doing the harming. And the only reason they would do that is to follow an order to do that. Now, anyone who knows anything about symbology, they'll know that checkerboard that's around the top of their heads there. You can see that on the left here. And what that 8-pointed square is, the 2 squares put together, I guess. It's like an octagon that's on the center of the crown chakra. Okay, so you'll know symbolically what that means. This is like the base consciousness of man being expressed here symbolically. And these people will do it without question. And so that's the real tragedy, right? This is one life force that is in one expression. So I need to say that again. It's an expression of the one life force working against another expression of the life force. If you take away the uniform and the ideas that you have, those who are willing to exact violence for a paycheck, right? Yet they take an oath, which means they fully are conscious of their personal responsibility for their own actions. Yet they take no responsibility for it in reality, right? So that in itself is a massive war crime, what they're doing. And until people start understanding it that way and actually expressing it outwards, this is going to keep continuing. And so this is what really is at the center of how this all gets doled out, right? Because you need someone to execute it through and get compliance and obedience through the use of fear. And this is what the purpose of these people that take this money, that swear an oath to do the opposite, right? To stand on dignity and honor and protect that. So you've got to think of that internal contradiction that's going on in these people and why they will probably most likely be alcoholics, having nightmares, struggling to sleep, probably struggle to find friends that aren't other police officers, my guess is. So these are the consequences that come with that. And the lack of personal responsibility and the willingness to do that. So most of these people would be broken from early on in childhood, and they're acting out their own trauma, of how they were treated. And this is the tragedy of what's really happening here that we don't look at. And so this is under the surface of all of that, right? But ultimately it's about order following. So what is Parliament, right? Parliament was set up to do what? To create legislation. But what is the role of legislation? How many people know that it's not to tell you how to live your life or dictate to you? It's not actually for that. Legislation, all it is to help deliver the day-to-day needs that we have to live together, cooperatively and peacefully, to deliver those services. That's why they're called public servants. So we're going to start looking at some deeper understandings of what public service is and how the whole system of governance was set up and for what purpose. So I'm going to come back with a really important website that has all that detail on it. Okay, so this is the commonlawconstitution.org website. This has got a bunch of a collection of historical facts that are easily provable. It's got quotes from historical figures, all to do with matters of law. So things you cannot verify for yourself, but they've also gone to the trouble of actually creating a 5-step understanding of how governance works. So I'm only going to go into a couple of them because I'll be here for longer than I like. I'm just going to read them. So 5 steps to understand the Constitution. Many people don't even know what a Constitution is. It's basically a set of standards that's a promise by government to stay within those confines so they can actually perform their duties as we, the people, have granted them the authority to do. So it's the law that binds government to stay within the moral principles that we all hold in our hearts. And as soon as they step outside of that, that's how we understand that they've become criminal. That's the purpose of a constitution. Because if we don't understand those standards, we can't actually identify when they become criminal. So it doesn't protect you. It's about it being in your mind to understand it. And if we all know what they are, then we'll know what to do when they cross that line and how we go about it. Right? So that's, if you don't know that standard, you can't do anything about it. And that's why this is critical information. And so the parents of, the Monash and all other parents, I guess, they don't know this, so they've let government trounce all over them. They've let them trounce all over them by allowing them to charge them taxes, to fund their criminal empire. Rates, the council does that through rates, so you don't own your property if you're paying someone rates, to live on your own property. Then you've got all the different kind of registrations you have. You've got register your vehicle. If you're going to do any activity, you've got to register. That's all different ways of ownership where you are signing yourself over as property to some other foreign body. Then you've got your levies, your fees, your penalties. You've got all these different ways that our time, energy, and labour is harvested through money. And so this is just a very clever way to keep taking your life force energy from you. That's never been the design of the public service. And this is what needs to start being understood by people. So we're going to read how this is meant to work. To govern, which means control, is to decide on what is morally acceptable and what is not within our community. It is to create boundaries to acceptable behaviour. That's essentially what governing is. So you can self-govern. You decide what is morally acceptable behaviour for yourself. You do that all the time. Yet in a collective, then we need to do what we call have laws, right? This will involve deciding on laws and then enforcing them. So who's really charged with that? Is it really a public servant, someone who's there to deliver a system of service so you can live free? How can that be a system of service if they're dictating to you on the boundaries of your behaviour? Is that a service? Doesn't sound like one to me. It sounds like despotism. The personal group of people who decide on the laws of the community hold the power because they hold the power to punish. And I said that earlier, right? So this is what it all boils down to, is how do you enforce a decision? And if you are a public servant who's now manipulated it, so you get to hold that power and you've got people who are willing to enforce those decisions, then you are the God, the Lord, the Master. And that's why these people in Parliament, what would I call them? I guess I'd call them predators, on some level. Yet we've granted them authority to be predators by paying for that system without knowing we're doing it. And then we don't know the set of standards that they've breached in order to hold them accountable in their private capacity. If we had that going, they would never step over that line. Because if you think about it, anyone who seeks to make decisions on the behalf of others, already they've got more power than exists in nature. So that by itself will corrupt you. It'll take you past the limits that you've even been aware you could go. And so there has to be some kind of mechanism that sits above that to make sure that it never gets out of control. All right, so now let's look at what the government created law, the statutes is. Part of the government deals with the creation of law is Parliament. Is known as the legislature, one of the 3 traditional branches of government. And this is incorrect, right? The judiciary is not traditionally a branch of government. It's just what we've come to learn is, but it actually isn't. That's meant to be separate. It's independent of government, and it's not even called a judiciary then. It's just the Supreme Law Council, which is the people's way to keep government under their control. So they never go out of control and their egos don't go running away with them. And that's unfortunately because we don't have that system, but we're meant to have it. That's why we're in the state we're in. So the legislature, Parliament in Britain, is made up of 2 houses, the lower and the upper houses, or the House of Commons or the House of Lords. In America, we call it the same here in Australia. The legislative branch as a whole known as Congress, well, we don't call that, we call it Parliament, divided into the House of Reps, so the lower house is the way we run it, and the Senate, the upper house. Government can only create law through this mechanism, and this type of law, the type of law it creates is known as legislation or statutory law. if the government has checks, balances, and limitations are placed upon it, because we all heard about that, checks, and balances, right? Well, then how can they create law? That doesn't make sense. There clearly must be a higher form of law above legislation. There must be rules and principles that limit the kinds of laws that our legislature can create. Otherwise, there's no checks and balances. So that's this bit, guys. Now, I'm going to encourage you to read this for yourself, right? Trial by jury. This is the way people govern. That's all I'm going to show you. This is, if you don't start doing your own research, then there's no merit in it for you. So I'm just going to leave that there, and I'm going to come back and do some more.